Mid-2020 was a wild time. The pandemic was in full swing, Zoom pranks were going viral, and the death of George Floyd sparked a global movement that inspired millions to rally behind what soon became known as Black Lives Matter. I vividly remember Blackout Tuesday. Nearly everyone I knew, myself included, posted a black square on their Instagram with the caption #BlackoutTuesday. Instagram stories overflowed with links to GoFundMe pages and resources for donations supporting the cause. And then, silence. Within a month, many who had passionately spread awareness about racial injustice seemingly vanished, or at least stopped talking about it. But by that point, millions of dollars had already poured in. The largest organization of the movement, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, reportedly raised around $90 million. Shortly afterward, reports surfaced alleging misuse of some funds. Most notably, the organization purchased a $6 million property initially described as housing and studio space for recipients of the Black Joy Creators Fellowship, though further scrutiny cast doubt on these intentions. To be clear, not all the funds were misused. Some of the money did end up going to grassroots programs, but the lack of transparency created room for some serious skepticism, especially when trust was already shaky. And as more stories emerged, it became increasingly clear that a significant portion of the donations might not have directly supported the intended causes. If I stop my explanation here, I might risk sounding like another far right-wing commentator trying to suggest that the Black Lives Matter movement was a front for riots, looting, and Marxist ideology, but that's not being honest. The movement forced countless people to confront systemic racial injustice in a way that could not be ignored. The questions I want to explore in this video are: how much awareness is too much? And at what point does activism on social justice issues begin to cause more harm than good? Social media has made global tragedies and injustices an everyday experience for anyone who spends even an hour or two online. And with this omnipresent awareness come both significant benefits and notable drawbacks. So let's explore the trend of performative activism, the concept of intentional ignorance, the role of privilege in choosing to engage or disengage, and how misinformation spreads through it all. June is a month we're all familiar with, right? The one in the middle of the year. This month is the perfect example of performative activism in action because it's when all the big corporations change their social media profile photos from their logos to their logos splashed with a bit of rainbow. Among these corporations is AT&T, who always makes sure to create a spectacle showing off their unrivaled support for the LGBTQ community. We can #TurnUpTheLove for LGBTQ youth together. Sign up with AT&T and join us to support the @Trevor Project. Oh boy, I sure hope they haven't been donating over $1 million to anti-LGBTQ lawmakers since 2021, right? They would never do that after this tweet, right? Well, according to a study by Popular Information, AT&T donated over $1 million to anti-LGBTQ lawmakers since 2021. Despite this, they still maintain a perfect score from the Human Rights Campaign, an organization that rates LGBTQ support but doesn't take political donations into account. So while they're waving their pride flag in June, they're also funding people who are actively working against the community. There are very obvious reasons companies would do this. By appearing pro-LGBTQ, they earn social capital and attract LGBTQ customers and allies, making the company seem more modern and progressive. But we also need to understand that a company isn't one person, it's a network of departments with conflicting priorities. The marketing team might genuinely care and push for pride campaigns, while the PAC or Government Affairs Department funds candidates who align with the company's financial interests. That disconnect isn't rare, it's just branding. This is a phenomenon that is increasingly happening at an individual level in our everyday lives. There's still a bit of a taboo around not sharing things that are always pro-progressive, and at the same time, an intense ridiculing if you're not thoroughly informed about every single social injustice that's happening in the world right now. Due to that pressure, and not due to a genuine care for the cause, people will simply follow the crowd and promote the same things that the people closest to them are promoting, so long as it keeps the shunning away temporarily. And that's the paradox. When awareness is driven by pressure rather than principle, it can end up doing more harm than good. It dilutes the message, overshadows the voices doing real work, and fuels waves of misinformation that are hard to reverse. Let's go back to the Blackout Tuesday incident. On the same post where people were sharing black squares with the hashtag Blackout Tuesday, many also added hashtags like #BlackLivesMatter and #BLM. The problem was that those hashtags became flooded with blank images, making it nearly impossible for activists and protesters to use them to track police activity, organize demonstrations, or share important resources in real time. It's the lowest effort solution to not being called out as anti-BLM, and yet it did even more harm than if those people were to just stay quiet, not post, and get labeled, though inaccurately, as anti-BLM. But in a time like 2020, that was completely socially unacceptable. This is one of the big problems with performative activism. For the sake of either not being socially ostracized or not being seen as someone with no knowledge on an issue, people will post superficial messages in solidarity that only make it harder for the actually useful, accurate information to be shown to more people. I'm sure most of you are at least somewhat aware of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine right now. Chances are you've had at least a few friends who are posting infographics and resources on their Instagram story to spread awareness. The problem is, while those posts can be a helpful starting point for learning, they almost always leave out the more complex, nuanced parts of the issue, and in many cases, they've been shown to spread misinformation or twist existing facts. For example, a popular graphic claimed, "Israel invests in protecting its people. Hamas invests in killing Israelis." This ignores that Israel's investments in protection also involve a highly militarized occupation, frequent airstrikes in civilian areas, and policies that have led to widespread displacement, surveillance, and blockade, particularly in Gaza, which has been under siege for over 15 years. The statement also implies a false binary. One side values life while the other doesn't. But war displacement and historical trauma shapes behavior on both sides. It's not as simple as one defends, the other kills. That logic shuts down real conversation about ending the violence and addressing root causes like statelessness, inequality, and occupation. And that's also the perfect recipe for misinformation, no matter which side of a movement you align with. On October 11th, 2023, Justin Bieber shared a post with the caption, "Praying for Israel" on his Instagram story. The real kicker? The image beneath the caption showed destruction in Gaza. As a side note, this is exactly why people with massive platforms, like celebrities, influencers, and public figures, need to be especially careful. With audiences in the tens of millions, even a single misinformed post can distort public understanding on a massive scale. Yet ironically, it's often those same people who are under the pressure to post something, anything, to protect their image, even if what they share is inaccurate or misinformation. Of course, this doesn't just happen to celebrities, it happens to anyone who has access to a social media platform. A fake memo claiming the White House had approved $8 billion in military aid to Israel was also spread widely on Facebook, appeared high in Google search results, and was boosted on X by accounts that had paid for verified checkmarks, giving the post an extra veneer of legitimacy. It's nearly impossible to break down a complex social issue into a single post or tweet, but these emotionally charged, bite-sized pieces of content, often intended to show support or justice, frequently oversimplify or misrepresent what's actually happening. And when that happens, they don't just spread awareness, they distort it. Do you really think you understand what's going on in Israel or Gaza just because you saw a few posts or headlines, especially if it's just from one side of the political spectrum? Probably not. And in this case, sharing half-truths or potential misinformation might be doing more harm than just staying silent. But ironically, the people who are most vulnerable to this kind of shallow understanding are the people that get most of their news from social media. A 2020 Pew Research study found that US adults who primarily get their political news from social media tend to be less engaged overall. They follow the news less closely and score lower on a range of political knowledge questions compared to those who rely on other sources. Of course, traditional media like TV and newspapers have their own biases baked into their programming, but here's what I think happens with social media. You're exposed to more headlines, more tragedies, and more injustices than someone who gets their news from print or radio, but your understanding of those issues is often shallower. You've heard more, but you know less. And another unintended consequence of always being tuned in, it can actually have the opposite emotional effect that increased awareness is supposed to do. Instead of making you more empathetic, constant exposure to injustices can start to make you numb to it. In 1992, registered nurse Carla Joinson identified a distinct form of burnout experienced by caregivers, characterized by a gradual erosion of their capacity to care for others. Rather than just feeling emotionally drained, those affected began to grow distant and disengaged, eventually losing the emotional connection that once fueled their compassion. And this later coined the term compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue stems not just from emotions, but from how our brains respond to prolonged stress and empathy. Mirror neurons, which help us feel others' pain, can become overstimulated with repeated exposure to suffering, dulling our emotional responsiveness. At the same time, chronic stress overactivates the limbic system, our emotional control center, raising cortisol levels and intensifying both mental and physical burnout. As we scroll past graphic images, heartbreaking stories, and urgent calls to action, our mirror neurons are repeatedly activated, trying to process the pain of others. But the human brain wasn't built to carry the weight of the entire world. The more we're exposed, the more emotionally overwhelmed we become, and eventually many people start to feel numb, detached, or powerless to help, which are classic signs of compassion fatigue. This is another reason why online activism can sometimes feel short-lived or performative. It's not always about apathy, it's often emotional exhaustion. When the limbic system is constantly overstimulated and cortisol levels stay high, people naturally shut down to protect themselves. What begins as genuine concern can fade into silence, not out of disinterest, but out of self-preservation. Now, this might bring up a commonly cited argument about silence and ignorance. Privilege. Oh, you're overstimulated? Try telling that to the millions of people whose lives depend on us actually giving a shit to save them. That's the kind of hostile attitude some people have toward the privileged, and while I understand where it's coming from, I don't entirely agree with it. It's true, being able to disconnect from suffering is in many cases a privilege. If your safety isn't at risk, if your rights aren't being violated, if your home isn't under threat, then yes, the option to simply look away is something not everyone has. But at the same time, we have to be careful to not weaponize that word so broadly that it erases human limits. Constant awareness is not only emotionally unsustainable, it's often counterproductive. You don't have to be in crisis yourself to feel the crushing psychological toll of witnessing endless crises, and it's not automatically immoral or selfish to place boundaries on how much global pain you allow into your mind each day. There's a difference between deliberate ignorance, choosing not to care, and intentional preservation, which is sometimes the only way that someone can stay grounded enough to help at all. When we frame every retreat as an act of privilege, we risk turning compassion into competition and shame into a motivator. That kind of moral absolutism flattens a very real and very human struggle: how to stay informed, present, and empathetic without completely losing yourself in the process. And when shame becomes the motivator, it often leads to exactly what we see all over social media today: performative, surface-level posts that dilute meaningful messages or spread half-baked information, not out of genuine care, but out of fear. Fear of being labeled apathetic, of being called out, and being seen as someone who doesn't care even if they do. So, do we need to bring back ignorance? Not exactly, but the way in which we process and engage with the world probably needs to change. Constant awareness doesn't automatically lead to meaningful action. Sometimes it just leads to burnout, misinformation, and a pressure to perform. And in that state, even good intentions start to suck. There are very few things that make my skin crawl as much as an Instagram social justice story that sneaks in: if you don't share this, you support insert terrible thing that's happening that you don't know enough about to speak on. Here's a crazy idea. You don't have to care about everything. In fact, you probably can't. And if you aren't yet well educated in a certain injustice, it's probably best to keep your mouth shut for right now so that those who are well educated can get heard more. A more sustainable approach might be to focus deeply on one or two issues you genuinely connect with, something global you're willing to learn about long term, and something local that actually affects your community. Do what you can there consistently. That's it. At the same time, pay attention to when you're tuning out because you're tired, not because you're indifferent. There's a difference. Setting limits doesn't mean you don't care, it just means you're being honest about your capacity, and that honesty is probably more useful than pretending to be informed about everything all the time. The goal isn't to care less, it's to stop confusing visibility with impact, and to start engaging in ways that are actually useful. If you want to become better educated on some modern issues, I have a whole playlist of my video essays on modern issues. Check it out right there. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I always love hearing what you guys think about this type of stuff. Makes me better informed, and that is it.